Hey guys, Angelo Esquivel here, back with another review, and today I'm going to be reviewing yet another pair of LED headlights, this time courtesy of a company called SEALIGHT. The methodology for this review will be different compared to all my previous LED headlight reviews because today we're going to be working with the 9005 socket headlights. Before we begin, I like to go over a few technical specs and details about the headlights. However, on the box there's no information that says anything about its rated luminosity. There is information in terms of its operating temperature, which is anywhere from -40 degrees Celsius to 85 degrees Celsius, and an estimated lifespan of about 30,000 hours, and the color temperature is 6,000 Kelvin with an IP rating of 67. Now, as you might notice with these headlights, there is a tiny fan on the back of them, and as with many LED headlights, they do need to dissipate a large amount of heat. The amount of metal on this particular portion of the headlight is pretty beefy. It is almost what I would imagine to be a solid metal construction, except for the keyed gasket right here on the front. There is a fan on the back here to help dissipate the heat. As we all know, aluminum does conduct heat relatively well. Although this fan being so small, we'll have to see how well it holds up. That 30,000 hour estimated lifespan is really more of a estimation of the LED diode itself and not the surrounding components, which when an LED light tends to fail, it's usually because of the surrounding components and not the diode itself. So cooling is particularly important. So hopefully this is sufficient. Down the line here, we've got, well, what would be considered a ballast if you were running an HID kit, but in LEDs we just call this a controller. Because I have never reviewed an LED headlight of this particular socket before, we're going to create a baseline using Sylvania Silver Star halogen headlights, and our test vehicle for this will be a 2018 Kia Niro. Now, before we begin, I want to explain a little bit more about the methodology of our testing for this particular set of headlights. And in order to do that really quick, I want to talk about headlight housings for a moment. This is not the vehicle we'll be testing the headlights on, but this is a good representation of what I'm talking about. So for many of my tests previously with other headlight bulbs that were LED, we've been using what's known as a reflector unit. In a reflector unit, light is projected in such a manner that it bounces off all these reflective surfaces. What we're going to be using today is called a projector unit. You'll notice it's very different. It's got this kind of fish-eyed lens that will focus the light in a particular direction, and this is particularly important because it completely changes the attributes of how light is thrown. So because of that, this test is very different from what we used to do testing things in reflector units. What we have here is the 2018 Kia Niro, and as you can see, it has a very large projector unit. We're going to see if the projector unit is capable of throwing light in a proper manner. Before we test out the LED headlights, we need to first create a benchmark to compare them to. What we're using are Sylvania Silver Star halogen headlight bulbs inside of the 2018 Kia Niro. What we're looking at right now is what we call the door test. The door test allows us to check and see how good the hot spots are. Inside of a projector unit, the hot spots should be in the center of each headlight's projection. As you can see, with the halogen headlight, the hot spots are exactly where they need to be. With LEDs, sometimes this is a problem. We got a nice beam pattern, and as you can see, from each hotspot, light radiates outward without causing any patchiness. Now, if we put on the high beams, you'll see a little bit more about how these single beam headlights work. Inside of the projector housing, there's a flap that opens up and down. This is so that when you're on low beam mode, which is still the same brightness, but it cuts it off sharply, you don't blind oncoming traffic due to glare and oncoming headlights. When your headlights are on the high beam mode, that flap is removed, allowing you to see much more down the road. We now have the LED headlights inside the vehicle, and once again we are performing the door test in order to gauge how accurate the beam pattern is in comparison to what the standard halogen headlights are putting out. Now this is important because the way a diode projects light is completely different from how a filament projects light. Diodes are extremely directional, whereas a filament inside of a glass container, i.e. the halogen, projects light in a 360-degree manner. Now, when looking at the beam pattern, you'll notice that we have some remnants of a hot spot, but the hot spots are not nearly as clearly defined as we have in halogen headlights, at least in this particular housing. Now, this particular housing is designed for halogen headlights inside of its projector housing, and what we're going to do now is turn on the high beams, and you'll see that the high beams are kind of wavy. You see it's got kind of it goes on the bottom and it waves up and down and then up and down again. So the pattern is not completely consistent and it is slightly patchy. Because we do real-world testing here, we're not going to rely on just the door test to try and determine how good any set of headlights are. We're actually going to go down the same stretch of road that I use to test every single pair of headlights that I've ever tested on this channel. So right now we are sitting in the road just going down. Now what we have on this particular road is what I call assisted lighting, meaning we have street lights pointing light down on the road, but we're going to move towards an area where there is no assisted lighting and it's only just the headlights. So we're going to go ahead and start going. So now down this road, what we're going to do is we're going to turn the high beams on. This is what it looks like with the high beams. We're going to kind of switch back and forth between high and low beam here. So go to high beam, and then low beam, then low beam, then high beam, then low beam, then high beam, then low beam, then high beam, then low beam. And in just a second we're going to go towards a corner, and that corner is going to lead us to a road with no assisted lighting from anything. Then as we turn around this corner right here, we'll be brought to a part of the neighborhood where there's no assisted lighting. We're going to stop right here. And now we're going to gauge how well the lights do just by themselves. Now this is just the standard low beam. We're going to put it on high beam now. And this is about how far out we go. We're going to do a little bit of a zoom here, just enough to try and get a good idea of what's going on. So we're going to go to low beam, and then we're going to go to high beam, low beam, and then high beam. And now back to low beam. And now we're going to drive down this part of the road. go any direction we're able to, which is right. Now we're going to slow down, and then we're going to take a right in this part of the neighborhood. And as we go down this road, we're going to continuously alter between high and low beam non-stop. And then that will conclude the portion of the test where we benchmark the halogens. We are now going to go down the same stretch of road at the same pace that we did with the halogen lights and do the exact same test with the LEDs. Looking down the road, there's no noticeable patchiness, at least not to the naked eye. And if we put the high beams on, we notice some reflections in the distance are more clearly visible, but nothing particular in terms of what we can see on the road directly in front of us. Now, part of this is with this new beam angle that's been created with these LEDs, the headlight housings may need to be adjusted to fit the situation properly. We have not currently adjusted the headlight housing. This is the headlight housing exactly the same way as it was with the halogen housing. The reason we're doing this is because we need to gauge just how well an LED can mimic the way light is output through a projector lens, like the way a halogen light does. So now we're going to go down the same stretch of road. And as you can see, once again, we have assisted lighting from the street lights. Now, the street lights, admittedly, around here aren't all that bright. We're going to flip on the high beams and then go back to low beams, high beams, and low beams. You'll see the reflections in the distance from the street signs are definitely much more noticeable. And part of that is because these LEDs are using a much wider light, much closer to 6,000 Kelvin. Things that are reflective in nature just seem to be much more noticeably reflective in this particular color temperature range. It's not necessarily an indication of just how bright the lights are, just more of an indication about how well a certain color temperature refracts light. And once again, we are coming up to the corner where we will enter the part of the neighborhood with no assisted lighting. Turning right here. And typically, areas with no assisted lighting is where LEDs and HIDs tend to do the best because of their color temperature. They have a very good contrast with the rest of the environment and the road. So we're just going to sit here for a second. And we're going to turn on the high beam. As you can see in the distance, things have lit up. Anything that's reflective in nature is now relatively visible. And We're going to go to low beam, go to high beam, low beam, high beam, and back to low. And now we're going to drive forward. And again, in areas where there is no assisted lighting, the contrast from the color temperature of these bulbs is definitely superior to the amber lights that halogen lights tend to put out. So driving in the real world, the lights do seem to perform adequately. However, comparing to the halogens, there are some pros and cons between the two. And now we're going to turn right into the subdivision. And along down this road, we're going to switch back and forth between high and low beam. You can see in areas like this, where we have some stuff overhead like trees, it gets illuminated. And that's once again due to the lights being projected down the road. As we go from high to low beam, the projector unit has a flap that opens up when the high beams are on to let the top half portion of the projector open up for the light. And that's what allows us to see further down the road. And that will conclude the test portion of the LEDs. So at this point, the results become very circumstantial. Although technically speaking, the halogen lights did project light much more focused down the road, the LEDs did have some advantages. One of those advantages we talked about while test driving was that the fact that they are 6,000 Kelvin allows for better color contrast in dark areas with no assisted lighting. Now, if you live in a country area where there is no assisted lighting, this could be very beneficial to you. If you live in a more urban environment where you have assisted lighting anyway, the amber color and the better focus of the hot spots with the halogens will provide better penetration for inclement weather, as well as better penetration through areas in general where your light is competing with other lights. So in that sense, yes, the projector unit is designed for halogen bulbs. That's why halogen bulbs work so well inside of this particular housing. What the LEDs are attempting to do is create a simple retrofit solution to convert over to something that admittedly, just if you look at the raw numbers, would probably provide a higher luminosity. But again, a higher luminosity doesn't mean better visibility. The way the light is handled and thrown is incredibly important, and we're getting much closer to the point where LEDs might become a viable replacement for halogens, but not until LEDs, that is, can mimic exactly the way a halogen bulb projects light outside of it, because if you can't do that, you can't get the proper hotspots for penetration. Before we end this video, I will show you what is the best of both worlds. And the best of both worlds is not going to be a simple retrofit like putting an LED inside of a projector housing designed for halogen bulbs, but instead doing a proper retrofit with something like a projector housing designed for HIDs using an HID bulb. So what we've done is we've lined up my friend's Kia Niro with the LED headlights pointing down the road. Now this is what you can see from my point of view with his car to my right. Notice what happens when I turn on my 35 watt HID headlight bulbs inside of an HID specific projector housing. These are H1 HIDs. HIDs do take a few seconds to warm up, but immediately my lights completely drowned out his light because my lights are just simply brighter. They're being projected down the road properly because the headlights are in a housing specifically designed to use this type of headlight. Overall, it's very commendable about how well this conversion kit actually works with this simple retrofit idea. That being said, the real reason it works so well is simply because it's a projector housing. And unlike a reflector housing that will simply scatter the light, the projector housing is doing its best to focus that light in a very specific direction, making it much more usable. We are getting close to the point where LEDs may be a viable replacement solution for halogen headlights, but I don't think we're quite there yet.